They rolled the gray crates onto the hardpan before dawn, when the wind off the high desert still smelled of cold stone and spilled fuel. March 1943. El Guettar, Tunisia. A captured gear yard lit by blackout lanterns and the pale blade of a rising moon. A German signals engineer eased back the latches on a squat American set, lifted a handset that looked too small for war, and pressed the rubber cup to his ear. What came back was not the battlefield's usual weather of crackle and lightning ghosts. It was a human voice, even and near as if the speaker were on the other side of the canvas wall. He blinked, then said the line the men around him would repeat all spring: "We have been talking in weather. They are talking in weatherproof." They were not novices. Their benches back home had worn smooth under AM work coils tuned like habits meters that danced the way they expected. Here the desert added its own sabotage ignition buzz from truck parks' artillery breath that rattled fillings dry air that made sparks into language, and the Americans spoke through it as if the noise belonged to another war. The yard boss, an armored Oberleutnant with oil under his nails, jabbed a finger at the ridge and sent a runner. "Key when you see my flare," he said, and when the star burned over the pass, the American voice came back level, ignoring the distance and the grit in the sky. They opened more crates. The handset with the telescoping rod, a canteen-sized handie-talkie, felt like a prank until it didn't. A mile over broken ground is not a theory when a company front is a mile wide. The pack set with the canvas harness hummed with a quiet that made the engineer hold his breath to make sure the silence between syllables was not a fault. He took his pencil and wrote it down without decoration, because numbers are the only language that survives an argument 1 to 3 miles for the little one, depending on ground and water. 5 for the pack set, when the world behaved like hills and fields instead of mountains and steel. The Oberleutnant said nothing, because the numbers were not the surprise. The surprise was that the voice did not become weather as the range grew. They strapped one into a turret and let a tank idle up to March RPM. In their own vehicles, ignition noise was a second crewman that never shut up. Orders wore static like a coat. The American set kept its channel like a man keeping a promise. No hunting across a dial as the hull shook. No fiddling the tuning wheel with a fingernail when the ground turned to corduroy. A click to a crystal-locked detent, and the net was there again, ready to be fed the next decision. The engineer did not say miraculous. He said mechanical and meant it as a compliment that could not be mistaken for praise. Sun took the frost off the tarps. Flies arrived to practice their tiny insistences. They pushed the tests farther, dirtying the air on purpose with the worst they could: bottle generator harmonics, sharp-edged bursts that mimicked lightning, a wash of ignition. The American voice shed the trash because it did not carry information in loudness. It carried it in the way the pitch wobbled around a center that did not move. And once a man has heard the difference, he cannot unhear it. Then they realized the effect was not simply clarity, it was tempo. If you do not have to repeat yourself, your orders shrink. If your channels do not wander, your prearranged switches become fact instead of hope. If your batteries are a logistics problem solved in advance, your net does not die at the hour the battle is most likely to need it alive. He wrapped the set in oilcloth and marked the crate for shipment, because good engineers do not trust first impressions, even when first impressions talk like this. The note he tucked under the straps was plain, so a tired colonel could read it without squinting. No static at range. Weeks later, under a European sky full of rain and coal smoke, he would hear the same clean voice cutting through artillery weather and think of the yard in Tunisia, the gray crates, the moment he understood that contact, not power, was the thing the Americans had decided to build in quantity. And he would hear his own sentence again, not with bitterness, only precision: "We have been talking in weather. They are talking in weatherproof." They laid the problem out on a chalkboard, because chalk is honest. An operations officer drew a battalion frontage, a string of hills, and a road that hooked left through a pass. The question was not philosophy. It was tempo. How fast could intent travel from regimental net to a company commander whose world was a rectangle of dust and shock, and how much of that intent would survive weather engines and fear by the time it reached the men at the hedgerow? In 1943, both armies owned radios and doctrine. The difference lay in how each had defined enough. Germany built for initiative carried by practiced hands and AM sets hardened by experience. The United States arriving late and heavy built for contact that refused to die under load and then manufactured it until the depots looked like geology. Stakes sat under the drawing like weights. If contact holds, a battalion can be short one bridge and still change axes in minutes. If contact fails, the same battalion becomes a set of brave fragments, each fighting the last plan it heard. The signals men translated that into range and probability. In infantry hands, a handie-talkie that made 1 mile across broken country meant a company front could speak as a single throat without sending a runner into artillery spray. On the battalion net, 5 miles of reliable voice meant reserves could pivot before the enemy's last shell fell, not after. Inside a tank squadron, a set that pushed roughly 25 watts into 10 crystal-locked channels gave a commander the nerve to flex a flank at speed and expect to be heard 7 miles rolling and more when halted. Numbers like that were not trophies. They were promises kept under motion. Constraints did not come from books. They arrived as headaches. AM lives in amplitude, and the battlefield is a machine that abuses amplitude for a living. Ignition noise from 100 engines, the iron rain of artillery, the sharp teeth of lightning in summer. All of it climbs aboard the signal as if invited. You can filter, shield, and pray, and the Germans had done each with skill, yet their Fugue 5 still asked its crews to ride gain and nurse tuning while the ground turned to corduroy. FM cheats the weather by moving the message sideways into frequency swing. The amplitude can be dirty, and the discriminator will still hand you a voice with the clicks scraped off. That engineering choice, written in varnished coils and stamped part numbers, multiplied itself when crystal control meant channels that did not wander, as hulls shook and logistics answered with batteries stacked to the roof. We kept the camera at eye level, because that is where decisions are made. In a panzer workshop, the chief leaned into a turret and listened to his own net, the familiar soft roar of engine hash wrapped around words like damp wool. He stepped down, wiped his hands, and listened to the American set again in the same steel cave. The difference was not louder. It was cleaner. Clean had a shape shorter orders because repetition was no longer tax. Prearranged channel changes that clicked into place without a hunt across a dial. Map corrections that took seconds instead of half a minute. He wrote one figure in his book because an army lives on figures, 10 preset channels on the tank, set fixed by crystals a clerk could issue by code card. Beneath it, he wrote the companion truth no one likes to admit out loud, a design that requires less skill to keep alive survives longer in the wild. Production was the shadow argument. A good radio that exists only in doctrine is a rumor. The American answer had weight measured in crates. Nets survive not only because modulation rejects trash, but because a dead set is replaced in hours, not nursed for days. Training scaled with the hardware's temperament. An operator who does not fight his tuning wheel all day has more mind left for the map. The German staffers did not pretend their own doctrine was weak. It had carried them far on the agility of small units and the habit of acting without a telegraph. But the war was getting louder, denser, faster. And that weather contact was not a luxury or a flourish. It was the only way a plan could remain a plan 5 miles past the line of departure. They began with the bones of the thing, because bones tell you what the animal is built to do. The American pack set lived in the low VHF, a band around 40 to 48 megacycles, where wavelengths were short enough for practical antennas and long enough to bend a little with the country. Its voice rode not on how tall the wave grew, but on how the pitch swung around a center, and between the antenna and the ear sat stages that punished anything that tried to shout through by sheer loudness. Limiters shaved amplitude spikes off like a carpenter taking down high spots. The discriminator read the small left-right sway as speech and ignored the rest. On a bench, the difference looked tidy. In the field, it was rude. Artillery could pound a valley into a bucket of nails, and the voice would still walk out of the noise as if it owned the path. They set a German AM set next to it, same table, same poisoned air. The band was not far away. 27 to 33.3 megacycles was a familiar country, and the Fug 5 pushed about 10 watts with an honest heart. But AM is proud of amplitude, and the battlefield takes pride in wrecking amplitude. Ignition hash from dozens of engines, the hard-edged burr of generators, the crack of summer sky all climb aboard the signal because amplitude makes room for them. You can filter and ground until the hull is a Faraday sermon, and still the ghosts stay. Then they realized the American choice had moved the fight to a place the ghosts did not want to go. The FM set did not need to be stronger. It only needed to be stubborn about what counted as information. Crystals were the other quiet decision. The tank radios ran 10 fixed channels across roughly 20 to 27.9 megacycles, each slice held in place by a sliver of cut quartz you could issue by code card. In motion, the value was immediate. A commander could call for a switch, and the whole troop could call one detent into a prearranged net without hunting the dial while tracks hammered the hull. In a German turret, the tuning wheel was a living thing. Vibration nudged it, heat walked it. The human hand that steadied it was busy with other problems. The Americans had paid their machining and logistics bill early and hidden the cost inside a click. Range numbers were the part that made staff officers lean forward. The little hand set the canteen body with a telescoping rod, covered about a mile over broken ground, and more over water, where the world behaved like a mirror. The pack set made 5 miles of reliable voice in country that looked like low hills and hedgerows, and inside armor, the 25 watts of the tank set gave 7 miles on the move with more when halted and antennas still. None of these figures were parlor tricks. They were the distances at which a company could remain a single mind, a battalion could remain a plan, a squadron could remain a formation instead of a collection of engines. They opened the cases and looked at the indignities a campaign inflicts. Moisture seals that forgave a creek crossing instead of turning a set into a brick. Connectors that locked with a quarter turn and did not shake loose at March RPM. Battery compartments that a sergeant could service with numb hands under blackout. The engineer from the armored force watched a private swap a pack set battery by feel and understood a different metric downtime in minutes instead of hours. Then he realized the net effect was not a headline number, but a slope. Systems that shed noise refused drift and accepted rough handling decayed slower under pressure, which meant the battalion's voice stayed itself farther into the day when the map began to tear. They tested from inside steel, because steel is where radios go to die. In a turret filled with the soft thunder of an engine at work, the AM set wore a fur of hiss that made every sentence a fight. The FM set arrived clean enough that orders grew shorter because repetition was no longer a tax you paid on meaning. They marked that change on paper with figures, but the feeling sat in the chest. Clarity changed tempo. Tempo changed the shape of decisions. By the time they tightened the last screw and snapped the lids shut, the men at the bench could state the problem without adjectives. Power and pride in AM had carried them far, but the other side had built for contact and supplied it by the crate. They took the sets out of the yard and into places where paper didn't matter. In late March 1943, along the El Guettar Road, the armored net climbed into the morning with the same nerves as the cruise engines rolling from idle to march and the air turning to filings around the aerials. A German signals sergeant sat on the turret rim and listened to his own Fuge 5 beating like a tired drummer under the ignition hash, then cupped the American handset to his ear and heard a troop leader shift a bound with words that arrived whole. 7 miles moving was not a legend on this ground. It sounded like a choice you could make at speed. When a battery went short of fuel and the column had to snake around a dry wash, the correction rode the net once, not 3 times, and the line of tanks did what men do when they are not arguing with the weather. They obeyed without hesitation. They pushed a pair of captured sets ashore in Sicily, and then again at Salerno, because duplication is how engineers believe. The beach was a dish of noise, the horizon braided with smoke, the kind of day when AM nets wore fatigue on their sleeves. The pack set in a lieutenant's harness spoke up the slope into scrub and rubble, 5 miles of reliable voice written not on a bench, but on hills where range markers were shattered walls and the antenna stubs scraped barbed wire. The test men took notes even while artillery stitched the field, because that is how they lived. Later at the truck, they compared the handwriting and found it almost dull in its agreement. Clarity and trash meant orders grew shorter. Shorter orders meant tempo. Tempo meant a reserve company stepping 2 minutes earlier than habit. 2 minutes is only 2 minutes until it isn't. They did the cruel thing to the little hand set on the Volturno, the kind of thing that makes or unmakes a reputation. A runner waded chest deep and slipped the set smacked a rock. The world went cold and bright, and the private who pulled it out hammered the water from the canvas with the heel of his palm and keyed up. The reply came back even. 1 mile over broken ground was a number with a body, now water on its back, and gravel in its seams. In the evening, the German engineer wrote a line without adjectives, a sentence that could live in a file the small one keeps speaking after a river. They carried the crates to Anzio, and then to the hedgerows in Normandy, where distance was not measured in open miles, but in right angles hacked from earth. AM loves a straight line. Bocage hates them. The FM voice walked around corners if the land would give it a sliver. Company fronts that were a mile across could still behave as one mind, because the little set made its mile, and battalions that had to pivot along lanes no wider than a cart could make the turn without sending a man down the road to find the rest of his war. Then they realized the interim admission they had been avoiding, saying aloud, this was not a boutique advantage. It was an everyday one. In a stone barn near St. Lo, a senior signals officer wrote the single clean sentence that would travel German technical developments were to be checked against the enemy, by comparing German with captured equipment. He did not underline it. He did not need to. The comparison had been the summer itself. When they pulled the lids in the Ardennes, and the sky turned to needles, and engines refused to start without curses, the American nets kept that extra mile of mind. 7 miles moving for the armor when the roads were teeth. 5 miles of pack set voiced through woods that swallowed sound. 1 mile for the handset, so a company did not split into brave fragments when snow bent the world into silence. The men who had started on the hardpan in Tunisia stood again, by gray crates this time, in a damp German yard that smelled of coal and thaw, and ran the same tests with colder hands. The results were rude in their sameness. Static tried to become language. The FM refused. Vibration tried to turn channels into drift. Crystals insisted on their detents. Batteries died, as all things do. Logistics replaced them before the plan did. The engineer closed his notebook, thumbed the dented telescoping rod of the smallest set, and understood why the field reports had begun to sound like repetition. Repetition in war is not boredom. It is proof. They learned that machines only buy you a chance. What made the chance into advantage was the way men used the silence between syllables. On paper, it looked like paperwork. Signal operating instructions, folded into map cases, channel cards that matched crystals by code, brevity that turned a platoon's need into 5 words. In the field, it sounded like tempo. A battalion that held reliable voice at 5 miles did not spend its morning restating its intentions. It spent it moving, and the difference showed up at noon as a line that had already bent where it needed to bend. The Americans treated radio not as an accessory, but as the bloodstream, and so they trained the bloodstream every day until it could run in weather. Reliability in the wild began with refusing to make the operator a mechanic at the moment he most needed to be a listener. The packset's controls were few and stubborn in the best sense, the kind of knobs that hit detents and stayed there when a man's shoulder slammed a hedge post. The battery change was a muscle memory done under blackout, with numb hands, a quarter turn, a slide, a reseat. Inside tanks, the 10 crystal-locked channels mattered less as a technical boast than as a promise a troop could switch nets with a single click, and every hull would land on the same slice of air because the slice could not wander. In motion, the number that kept recurring in notebooks, 7 miles for armor rolling more when halted, was not romance. It was the width of a squadron's mind when engines made the antenna whip and men were thinking 3 bounds ahead. At the small end, the handsets 1 mile over broken ground meant a company lived as a single idea instead of 4 brave fragments shouting into carpentered lanes of earth. Weather had always been the hidden adversary. AM's pride and amplitude had made generations of fine technicians. It had also trained a reflex to nurse the gain and chase the dial when the world turned to iron filings. FM converted that work into something else. The discriminator threw away thunder because thunder was not information, and the limiter shaved off the peaks the way a mill hand takes a board to thickness. Then they realized the chain reaction that followed had little to do with the bench and everything to do with doctrine. A commander who expects clarity speaks shorter. A net that arrives at the ear as a clean tone invites discipline because it makes discipline feel like speed. Authentication drills and challenge and reply took seconds when the channel did not wobble. Pre-briefed channel switches that would have been an act of faith on AM became routine because crystals held their place when steel shook. The logistics were not scenery. They were the script. Radios that work until noon and die at 1 are curiosities. Radios that can be kept alive in quantity turn into operations. The American answer looked like boredom. In a depot, stacks of batteries, at the correct voltage crates of crystals cut and sorted by frequency spare sets that arrived before grief did. A dead pack set did not trigger an improvised bench on a tailgate and a half day of cursing. It triggered a swap, 10 minutes of careful hands, and a return to the net. In armor, a failed control head did not end the conversation for the day. Another head went into the rack, and the troop kept its 7 miles. That cycle, repeated across hundreds of miles and months, meant the nets decayed slower than the day did. When artillery laid a roof over a battalion front, the first minutes after the last round mattered. With FM, those minutes were not wasted in re-establishing who could hear whom. Training scaled to the temperament of the gear. An operator who does not spend his attention steadying a wandering dial has space in his head for the map. Net checks sounded like ritual because ritual is how you make complexity into habit, a roll call at first light, a test phrase that carried the day's authentication, a scheduled switch before a phase line so no one hunted on the move. The discipline showed up in small mercies. A flanking troop reported a culvert gone, and the route change rode the armor net once, not in a rosary of repeats. A company commander asked for smoke on a hedge corner and did not have to hear his own request come back 3 times through a blanket of hiss. The difference between once and 3 times is not poetry. It is minutes. Minutes become position. From the adversary eye level, the hardest part to admit was that none of this felt dramatic when you stood next to it. The pack set's case was canvas and corners. Its sound was unremarkable until the weather rose. Its range number, 5 miles in ordinary country, would have sounded modest in a lecture hall and decisive in a wood. Inside a German turret, the old habit of nursing the wheel was a comfort until the ground turned to corduroy. Then the American click into a fixed channel felt like an insult to craftsmanship precisely because it removed the craftsman from the loop. Power had been a kind of pride. Here the pride became contact itself, and contact was something you could count 1 mile for the small set across a company front, 5 for the pack, 7 for the armor on the move, more when they halted, and the aerials stood still. The war's second half was louder and faster than its first. Engines multiplied. Artillery thickened the sky, found new ways to throw electricity into the air. In that weather, the systems that shed noise refused drift and forgave rough handling did not win battles by themselves. They did something crueler and more useful. They let plans survive contact with motion. A regiment that could remain on net 5 miles past the line of departure could keep changing its mind without tearing itself into brave pieces. An armored squadron that could change channels in 1 click could keep its flank elastic in mud. An infantry company that could talk a mile without a runner could remain one mind when a hedgerow tried to make it 4. Reliability training. Radio's fuel doctrine. The list read like staff work, and it was. The field translated it into a single sensation at the ear. A human voice near and even speaking through weather, as if weather were only the frame. They timed it, because timing is how you turn a hunch into a decision. On a gray morning near the Rhine, with bridges turned into absence and the wind smelling of wet coal, a German signals officer stood beside a map table and put a stopwatch to an American net. He could hear the troop leader's voice through an interpreter's headphones, clipped and unhurried, the sound of a formation changing shape while moving. The order ran down a stack of 10 preset channels like a hand running down piano keys, 1 click per detent holes adjusting their arcs while tracks hammered mud into ruts. From the first syllable to the last affirmation, the sequence took less than half a minute. He looked at his watch again, then at the ground outside where his own crews were still repeating themselves through the familiar wool of engine hash. 30 seconds was a number with a knife edge. It cut the morning into before and after. The turning point was not a single battle name, but a saturation point, the way rain becomes flood without any one drop to blame. Since Tunisia, they had collected ranges, and ranges grow into doctrine when the figures keep refusing to change. 1 mile for the small set across a company front. 5 miles of reliable voice for the pack set through hedges and low folds of land. 7 miles moving for the tanks with more when halted and aerials still. Each value was modest when you set it into a room. Each was decisive when fused with the speed of engines and the thickness of late-war artillery. On the Rhine, the numbers met conditions that should have unmade them cold, that turned breath into fog sky, that hummed with electricity, ground chewed into a texture that shook dials for a living, and the values held. Then they realized the metric that mattered was no longer range. It was continuity. The net did not fall apart when the world did. Inside a turret, the realization arrived as a small humiliation. The German loader braced an elbow against the set he knew too well, riding the gain, as the driver throttled up, listening to vowels dissolve into the texture of the engine. The commander made a small circle with 2 fingers switch, and the operator hunted half a dial's width to recapture a net that had walked 3 marks in vibration. In the American troop crossing the same mud, the operator's finger moved once to a detent, and 10 hulls shifted to a pre-briefed slice of air that could not wander, because a sliver of rock said it could not. The difference between hunting and clicking is a handful of seconds until it isn't. It becomes the length of a hedgerow you fail to seal the half-platoon that turns the corner before you do the gun that speaks, while yours is still reacquiring grammar. They had tried to make the weather a friend, to teach crews to live inside the hiss with a kind of musician's ear. It had worked when the war was younger and the sky less crowded. Now the war made its own climate ignition from 1,000 vehicles, artillery laying an electrical roof, generators growling in every rear area, storms of iron that turned amplitude into a bad neighborhood. The FM sets did not become stronger in that weather. They became indifferent to it. Limiters and discriminators turned crashes into scenery, the way a well-made window turns rain into a film you notice and then forget. The stopwatch at the map table told the story in a cleaner tongue than any theory. 30 seconds to reslice a squadron, less to correct a route. Orders that did not require a second or third stamp to make themselves legal. On a day when every minute contained 10 separate demands, the net returned time like a quartermaster returning rifles. The metric tied to the inflection was not exotic. It was the same figure they had been writing for 2 years with an almost embarrassed fidelity. 7 miles moving. He watched an armored column take a shallow S to cut away from a blown culvert and keep a flank within that 7, while smoke turned the river line into a blindfold. 7 miles is a map distance when you look from a staff room. Inside a formation, it is a mind's reach. If the hand at the center can touch the furthest knuckle without sending a runner, the hand can still be a hand when it meets resistance. When the range is real under motion, the formation remains a single argument with itself, instead of a set of voices losing their places in the script. He was not blind to the other half of the arithmetic. Radios belong to logistics as much as they belong to physics. He saw crates come forward with the right batteries at the right voltage, the spare controls that went into racks without a sermon. The crystals sorted like coin. He had lived the opposite a day, lost to nursing a dynamotor on a tailgate. The ritual hunt for a ground fault, through paint and rust. The way good men become bad mechanics when a net goes dark at noon. The American answer replaced failure before grief hardened around it. Net checks felt like boredom until the barrage. Then boredom became speed, because habit did not have to be invented under pressure. They took the stopwatch to the infantry next, because fairness is a form of self-respect. A company pushing through orchard and ditch kept 1 mile of voice without mailing a man along the line of trees to collect acknowledgments like stamps. 1 mile in the first year of the war was a luxury. In the last, it was the only way to keep a front from becoming 4 unrelated arguments the first time the map and the ground disagreed. The small set did what its modest number promised, while wet to the skin, while knocked against stone, while handled by men who had just been on their bellies in a ditch. There was no theater to it. Only a voice that stayed a voice instead of becoming weather. The inflection crested in a kind of quiet. Reports from battalions that had lived under the same roof of noise all winter began to sound like each other, and the sameness was the point. Range figures that did not collapse in bad hours. Channel plans that did not walk away under vibration. Order cycles measured in seconds instead of the time it takes a man to shout twice and be understood once. He set the stopwatch down because he no longer needed it to tell him what he could feel in his teeth. The other side had built a way for intent to survive motion. Power in watts, in pride, had been a noble goal. He could not pretend it was the same thing as contact. In the file he would write it plainly so that tired men could not miss it for style. The modulation that refuses weather, the channels that refuse drift, the logistics that refuse delay. Together they extend a formation's mind by miles and minutes. That was the turn. Not a miracle, not an indictment of craftsmen, but a metric. 7 miles moving, 5 miles across a battalion net in ordinary country, 10 preset channels that could be reached by a click instead of a hunt. Numbers that had started as a shock in a desert yard and ended as the shape of how fast an army could think while it moved. They packed the crates for Europe because war teaches even the proud to copy what works. The reports went home with the same plain numerals scribbled in their margins: 1 mile for the small set. Across a company front, 5 for the pack. When country ran to hedges and low folds, 7 for armor on the move, and more when stilled and staff men turned those figures into peacetime sentences. Procurement orders changed their verbs. Training syllabi made brevity a reflex instead of a hope. Factories learned to cut quartz in bulk and to ship batteries the way they once shipped boots. None of it looked like drama. It looked like 1,000 small obediences to the same idea: contact first, everything else after. On ranges where crews now fired at steel silhouettes instead of men. Instructors took a new pleasure in silence. The lesson was that you did not have to earn a clear net with tricks. You could expect it and plan against it. That expectation curled itself into tactics. Units rehearsed channel changes as steps in a dance rather than an act of faith, and the steps held when engines shook the hulls because detents and crystals made drifting a superstition from another century. A generation of operators learned a reflex that would outlive the war. When thunder arrives, keep speaking. The limiter will shave it away, and the discriminator will hand you the words. For the men who had started at the hardpan yard, the legacy took a quieter form. They could now name the thing that had once felt like a magician's trick under blackout lanterns. FM had not given the other side a louder voice. It had given them the right to shorter sentences. Logistics had not conjured strength from nowhere. It had denied failure the afternoon it needed to harden. Doctrine had not been rewritten by poetry. It had been penciled in by numerals that did not change when the weather turned against them. They could look back along the chain modulation that refused weather channels, that refused drift supplies, that refused delay, and see how an army had stretched its mind by miles and minutes without ever calling it a miracle. Spring came on wet fields and museum cases followed. A black-bodied hand set rested behind glass with its telescoping rod dented where a private once hit a rock in a river. Visitors read plaques. The old signals officer did not need them. He leaned closer until the glass ghosted his face over the dull metal and heard as clearly as he had the first morning a human voice speaking, as if from the next tent. He smiled not at marvel, but at memory, and let the sentence return to him as steady as a net that will not die. We have been talking in weather. They are talking in weatherproof.